Hi, everyone. It's Peter. And what we're going to talk about today is, I think, a seemingly perhaps uninteresting topic to many. That is the art of very long ago, like way back, well before classical antiquity. Um, Basically, the art of the early ancient world, and what I think until recently used to be called the Near East. Mesopotamia is another word that's often used. The region between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And we're going to look, uh, again, in a kind of introductory fashion, not particularly academic or, um, you know, super precise or detailed way, but get a sense of what the achievement was of Sumerian artists and Sumerian cultures in terms of setting into motion certain conventions, devices, stylistic tendencies in art at that time, and in its own way, uh, having an influence on the art of our own time. Um, One of the interesting problems that's set into motion from any study of art, particularly from its origins, of course, is where do the choices of the artists that they made, where do those choices come from? And you sort of run into an interesting problem of discovery versus invention. Um, is art reflective of the world as it is, so that artists set up images in such a way to reflect that world, or is the artist's own subjective vision and the demands, say, of a patron or some other outside influence really setting it up? It makes for a very interesting discussion, particularly at the origin points of art, um, in terms of assessing why people did what they did, and again the effect on later art, later cultures. The Stele of the Vultures is a great place to start. It's probably more proper title is the Victory Stele of Aenatum or Aenatum. Um, just to get the terminology straight, and we'll just look at the sort of reconstruction. This particular set of stone fragments is in the Louvre Museum, and um, so it's not intact like the famous Stele of Hammurabi with that law code on it. Okay, so what is a stele? We should probably start with that. A stele, in essence, is a kind of marker. It's like those historical markers you might drive by on the highway that, I suppose a few people actually stop to look at. It's intended to commemorate an event of some kind, and there's probably going to be mention of the people taking part in the event and so forth. So the artist who is going to make something like this is necessarily going to have to make some choices in terms of conveying the importance of the event, to pick something out of the stream of time, so to speak, and set it up in visual terms is a very interesting enterprise. And we know, if we study prehistoric art in detail, that doesn't seem to be so much the case, or if it was the case, we don't have any clear means to extract that information. The Stele of Anatum is definitely and deliberately intended to commemorate, that is to say, put in memory and have persist in memory a particular event. And in this particular event, again using the word victory, it refers to a military conflict, a military event. The historical aspect is pretty important, because that's not very common in art prior to this time, that we can sort of say, an artist depicts a particular event that happened in time and space, and the artist intended to, as I mentioned earlier, fix that in memory. One of the critical pieces in that process of historical memory, besides visual representation, is going to be writing. That is to say, marking out in time and space is aided by conveying that information in written form. So there are indeed inscriptions that describe who is here, particularly the leader of the forces of Lagash, and this is the conflicts are sort of endemic to this region from its very inception of the great civilizations of Sumer and going forward. Who's involved and basically what's going on, and this helps us kind of locate more specifically than we might with other visual representations. Locate this as indeed a historical event. The part that we pay particular attention to in terms of the transformation of art going forward is this battle scene fragment, where we can see the ruler, Eannatum, of Lagash. And again, Sumer is composed of these different city-states, oftentimes under the patronage of a god, and oftentimes having a single kind of priest king, or certainly the king of one of these city-states is endowed with almost a divine aura. And victories like this certainly didn't hurt. And so what's going on here is interesting on multiple levels. And again, apologies for not being able to cover this in the kind of detail that we really could, but let's just take a quick dive into what's happening. We have a very clear sense, and the artist has done a remarkably effective job of conveying this very clear sense of movement. So, for instance, the scene reads, and this is an interesting convention in its own right, to see in lots of examples of art, really right up to the present, a tendency for motion in a visual field to move from left to right, and that's indeed what's happening here. The eye follows. It's almost, as literal as it gets, an arrow, in this case spears, but the point, so to speak, is taken. With this tightly organized group of soldiers, you can see the artist has been very economical in terms of representing them by hands and spears and shields moving in this very compact formation behind Eannatum. Eannatum himself definitely has a kind of larger-than-life presence, and you can see that in both scenes. Here he is striding forward, and below he's riding in a chariot. Here the spears are slightly different, but the overall sense of a massed, organized rank is paramount. The positions of the soldiers, alert, attentive, garbed in helmets, carrying spears, carrying shields, stands in remarkable contrast and deliberate contrast to the mass, disordered, chaotic, lifeless bodies of their defeated opponents. And you can see how the artist has used the convention of the ground line, also supported by this script. And I don't know Sumerian, so I can't read that. And there's probably, I should actually go look at the Louvre website to get the specifics, but let's not worry about that for right now. But the script area, this division is what's often described as a ground line, because that's literally what it is. It acts as the ground. Is then supporting this next layer. It's like a kind of cake, if you will, these different registers of defeated bodies, dead bodies, over which literally in this case, the troops of Eannatum are marching. We don't have the remains, so to speak, in the lower register where Eannatum is in his chariot to echo the device in the upper register, but I wouldn't be seriously unsurprised if that hadn't repeated itself. So it's this sense of a kind of invincible and victorious force, where the outcome, the victory, is not really an issue, and presumably in part that's because of the patronage and oversight of the god of Lagash, known as Ningirsu. That's very typical in a Mesopotamian culture to, in essence, assign victory and just general supremacy to the local patron deity. It's also worth remembering, in terms of visual convention, the reliance by the artist on a kind of what's the right word? Composite view of the figures. The most vivid way in which this is represented. There are probably two that are very obvious from this. One is the tendency to put main characters, in this case, in Autumn right here, in a kind of frontal view through the torso. So this is very recognizable to people, seeing people from the front. And then lower down, much more typically, the legs will be shown in profile. And the same thing happens in the head. So human heads are shown in profiles, sort of more interesting in a lot of ways, the line of the nose and chin and what have you. But if you look more closely at the eyes, you'll see that those are shown from a frontal perspective. So this is a kind of twist, sometimes described as twisted perspective, composite perspective, showing the human form from multiple viewpoints to convey a kind of shorthand, if you will, and a very, again, using that word memory, a memorable representation. We can think about this in a bigger sense, and it opens up some interesting problems. To what degree are artists thinking in terms of a kind of idea in their heads? Conceptual representation, for instance, is a phrase used to describe that sometimes, where we have an idea of what a general should look like, or what a human being should look like, or a mass of soldiers should look like. And especially because battles are chaotic and complex situations, that concept might include stripping down to a minimum the most recognizable attributes. An optical representation takes into account those elements in the scene that are, in essence, found in nature, that are seen by everyone. So, for instance, soldiers are going to carry spears, they're going to wear helmets. In Autumn is a large and powerful man. These kinds of these things are, in a sense, beyond convention. They just are what they are. Dead bodies on a battlefield don't stand upright and carry spears. So the artist is clearly making a choice. Whether we know the artist was aware of that or not is a question we'll probably never resolve unless we, were so lucky as to come up with an artist training manual from Sumer, in the 25th century BCE. That's probably unlikely. Anyway, it's really quite important on a number of levels. This reflects one of this fragment of the Stele, reflects some of the problems of studying ancient art, but also the great rewards as we get a kind of visual window. And fortunately, as Sumer is among the earliest civilizations to invent writing, a kind of literary window into at least some of the priorities, some of the ideas, perhaps even thoughts and feelings, much more subtle, much more subjective, of a long vanished civilization. There is a section, speaking of thoughts and feelings, that this is, the sort of informal name of the Stele. This is what it's named after, of vultures carrying birds carrying off the severed heads and limbs of the defeated enemy, the bodies of these, the losing side, in essence, being subjected to the butchery, in essence, of the victorious side. And this reflects a kind of reality. So armies of the ancient world did not take prisoners, as typically a fight to the death. And carrion birds, mentioned that's what Homer's Iliad opens with, are a common feature of battlefields in the ancient world, and indeed perhaps still are around the world today. Anyway, a fascinating insight into ancient history and Sumerian culture in particular.